Hello, and welcome to another episode of The Switch. My name is Patty Hampton, and I will be your host today. Did you know that nonprofit HR has served thousands of mission-driven organizations over the past 20 years? This episode is all about nonprofit retention practices. Listen in as Lisa Brown Alexander, President and CEO for Nonprofit HR, shares nonprofit detailed data on turnover, insights on common retention challenges, and proven strategies to increase retention. Share this production in your communities and download the slides and transcripts. Visit nonprofithr.com/The Switch for a video recording, presentation, and other assets. Without further ado, here's Lisa.
Delighted to join you all today. Thank you so much. So what I'd like to do is dive right in. We're going to focus on three main things today. One, we're going to share with you the results of our most recent survey around retention practices. So we'll share what we found. We're going to give you some insights on retention based on our experience working with hundreds of nonprofits across the country and the data that we found, and explain a little bit more about what the data means. And then we'll talk about some action planning that you can focus on for your organization, making sure that your retention practices align to support your mission at the end of the day. All right, let's get started. We had 350 organizations participate in this particular survey, with the strongest representation coming from social and human services at 43%, followed by education at 18.9%, and then health and health-related services at 12%. The other segments of the nonprofit sector, including arts and culture and environmental groups and animal rights organizations, also participated, but at a lower percentage. On average, 23% or 23.9% of those participants have operating budgets between $1 and $4.9 million. We had organizations that were in other segments, budget segments, but the average and the highest group of participants came from that $1 to $5 million segment. Just another additional breakdown of those who participated. You can see where your organization falls, whether you're in animal welfare or you're an association or you're in education. This was the breakdown of participation. In terms of budget size, these are the participants by budget, and you'll see that, as I mentioned before, the greatest participation came from those organizations that had budgets of $1 to $4 million, followed closely by organizations with less than $1 million, and then, as you can see, groups between 10 and 14 million, and then greater than 40 million made up the bulk of the rest. We also asked organizations where they are in their organizational life cycle. We know that nonprofits are born every day. We also know that organizations shutter their doors. And then we have organizations that are in between. The vast majority of those who participated in the survey were mature organizations, sustainable organizations, and ones that have been around for a long time. That's where the vast majority of participants fell.
This event was originally recorded as a Nonprofit HR webinar. Check out other Nonprofit HR events and virtual learning opportunities at nonprofithr.com/events.
All right, so let's get into the data. So one of the most important questions we asked as part of the survey was whether or not organizations participating had a formal retention strategy. And I think this was probably one of the most, I would say, maybe disappointing elements of the findings, that even today, even despite the fact that we have a 3.6 unemployment rate and we are in a job seeker market, the vast majority of nonprofits are not formally planning for or strategizing around employee retention. And so you'll see here that 80% of nonprofits, those who participated in this survey, operated without a formal retention strategy, whereas only 19% have a strategy in place, something formal that dictates how they're going to focus on keeping staff in place. All right, so in terms of budget, just a little breakdown. We did a contrast between the smaller organizations and the larger organizations that participated in this survey, and what we found was there were some improvements in terms of how many organizations had retention strategies in place by size, right? So smaller organizations tended not to have a retention strategy in place, 89% saying no, whereas those organizations with budgets of 40 million or more, only 65% of organizations operated without a retention strategy. And so it got a little bit better. The larger the organization, the better it got. But it's still important to note that 65% of those nonprofits with budgets of 40 million or more are operating without a retention strategy. So that's notable. We also noted that of those who did participate in this survey, 25% came from those who had retention strategies came from the health services and health education space, followed by social services and human services. 26% of participants in our survey came from that space and had retention. They're most likely to have retention strategies in place. So if you happen to come from these two subsegments of the sector, you're leading the pack, and we appreciate the fact that you may have something in place. So another really key data point in the survey was understanding what segments of staff nonprofits are most challenged with, right? And what we learned, to no surprise to us and likely no surprise to you, is that employees under 30 represent the hardest segment of the nonprofit workforce to retain. They were followed by organizations in specific program and administrative areas at 21%, followed by entry-level staff. Now, the important thing to note is that entry-level staff are oftentimes, but not always, also those under 30. And so this is really a segment of our workforce we need to dial into. Many nonprofits rely heavily on recent college grads to fill positions, both frontline and back office positions. And so this is a segment of the workforce we need to pay attention to as organizations. So just a point of note, mid-level staff are also kind of at risk here because we find that organizations are struggling with retaining that segment of their workforce. Okay, so that's a quick snapshot on those most challenged with being kept in an organization. Again, we dissected the data by budget size and realized that organizations that are smaller were really the ones that struggled the most retaining the employees under 30, whereas larger organizations, their greatest struggle was employees in specific program and administrative areas, and also in entry-level staff. So regardless of the size, it's that younger segment, the folks who are kind of early career professionals that we're having the hardest time hanging on to. Of the organizations that were struggling with retaining employees under 30, animal welfare, education, environmental, human services, and human and civil rights, and social and human service organizations were those most likely to struggle the most with under 30, whereas the association and arts and culture space struggled the most with retaining mid-level staff. So just interesting data around what sector organizations are faced with and challenged with. We spent some time examining what some of the drivers were for voluntary turnover is dissatisfaction and disengagement with organization or culture. And that is at 26.18%, followed by dissatisfaction and disengagement with leadership at 21.47%, followed by lack of professional development at 18%, lack of opportunity with upward mobility and career growth is the largest driver of voluntary turnover in the nonprofit sector. The lack of opportunity for upward mobility and career growth. Now, keeping in mind that the vast majority of nonprofits are smaller organizations, which stands to reason then that there might be limited opportunities for upward mobility. If you're an organization with a $4 million budget, chances are you don't have more than 20, maybe 30 employees at most. And if that's the case, there will be limited opportunities for staff to move upward and to experience career growth within your organization. So there's a lot of kind of synergy here with this data. We did note that the second leading driver for volunteer turnover was around compensation and benefits. So money still matters, right? If you're in a state that has not implemented living wage regulations and legislation, know that those organizations that pay a living wage are those that will be able to attract more people. Those organizations that don't pay a living wage in today's economy and in today's unemployment climate will find themselves challenged with retaining staff, right? So comp and benefits still matters. That has not gone away. But it's also important here to note that culture and organizational culture is also a key driver for voluntary turnover, right? So we'll note that disengagement and dissatisfaction with organizational culture is the third leading driver for voluntary termination. We'll talk about that some more later today, but it's really critical that you understand what's going on within your culture and address those elements of the culture that are dysfunctional. And so I realize that you may represent the human resources function, you may be the executive director for your organization, or maybe have some other role. But ultimately, the management and ownership of workplace culture is really a key driver for turnover. As you can see, there are other reasons: pursuit of higher education, family situation, career change. All of those are contributing factors. But the top three reasons for leaving is lack of opportunity, upward growth, money and benefits, and disenchantment or disengagement with culture. We asked the question of folks, what are the kind of most commonly quantitative retention metrics that they had in place in their organization? And we found that of those who participated in this survey, 97% were tracking their turnover rate, which is encouraging. That's very, very good. Other organizations were tracking tenure, how long people stayed in the organization, followed by first-year resignation, right? So folks who leave within their first year of employment. I think it's very notable that we have a good clip of organizations who are tracking high performer resignation, right? So those people in your organization that you consider to be critical to the success of your organization, tracking how quickly they resign is a critical metric to measure. And so just pay attention to that. If you have a high performance staff and you need to monitor what's going on with them, just be sure to understand their needs as part of your retention practices. We asked participating organizations if they were even tracking retention metrics, and we were encouraged by the fact that 51% of you said that you were, and then 48% said that they weren't. So there's a balance, roughly a 50-50 split between those who are tracking retention metrics and those who are not.
You have been listening to The Switch, a nonprofit HR podcast on powering your people with talent management insights, best practices, and hacks. Looking for a thought partner to help you integrate talent into your mission's strategic plan? Well, the good news is Nonprofit HR has solutions to meet your unique talent management needs. Strategic planning is an annual ritual for many nonprofits. Yet, countless organizations plan for programs and fundraising without thinking about the talent needed to meet those goals and ultimately their mission. With more than 20 years of expertise under our belt and the bench strength of credentialed consultants, we partner with all mission types and offer solutions that span project-based human resources consulting and outsourcing, search, total rewards, and DEI. Join the community of social impact organizations that have trusted nonprofit HR to help them achieve their full potential through their people.
We asked also asked the question about why you use and how you use retention metrics. And we found that we asked the question, are you using it to develop organizational and talent management strategy, or are you using it to improve organizational and talent management strategy? And what we noted was most organizations are using their retention data to improve their talent management strategy rather than develop it, right? So that's an interesting point of note. Just noting how organizations are using this retention data to improve what they do, improve their culture, improve their benefits, improve the work environment to foster higher levels of retention. So the question is, does your organization have a turnover problem, right? If you had to benchmark where you are in relation to those other organizations that may have participated in this survey, where does your organization stand? Are folks kind of jumping ship, or as this image depicts, jumping out of the bowl to leave your organization? Or are they staying with you? So let's take a look at what we learned about turnover rates from other organizations. What we learned from this survey, interestingly enough, is that the average turnover rate is currently 21.3%. So what does that mean? It means that if you're at 14 or 15 or maybe even 6% or 5%, your organization is doing a great job of holding on to people. Conversely, if your organization is seeing turnover rates of 35 and 40%, you're trending kind of ahead, right? And you're not necessarily retaining staff at the same levels as some of your peer organizations in the nonprofit sector. So it's a good kind of average turnover number to benchmark yourself against. For 10 years, Nonprofit HR conducted the Nonprofit Employment Practices Survey. And in the last year of that survey, which was 2016, that turnover rate was about 19%. So we're seeing it creep up just a little bit. We also broke down the turnover rate by voluntary and involuntary turnover. And you'll note here that voluntary turnover is trending or averaging at about 16, 17%. And average involuntary turnover, meaning retirement, layoffs, those kinds of things, was trending at about 5.2%. So what you can do is just use this information to understand where your organization stands. In terms of retention strategies that we see most commonly used by nonprofits, these are they, right? Learning and professional development opportunities is the leading strategy or tactic used by organizations to retain staff. Investing in learning, which is critically important because we are in a learning culture. Our workplace, our environment, the society is about continuous learning. Things are changing so quickly that it's critical for employees at all levels to remain current, not only with their respective professions, but just in general, learning soft skills and hard skills. And so, we applaud those organizations that are deeply investing in learning and professional development. But I think it's also important to note that right behind learning and development is culture, right? Having a healthy culture will impact your ability to retain staff. Conversely, if your culture is not healthy or it's dysfunctional, that will be a driver for premature turnover or voluntary turnover. So learning and development, investing in that, making sure that you have a healthy workplace culture, facilitating employee engagement and ensuring that people are engaged in their work and the work of the organization are also drivers that we see most commonly used by nonprofits. Interestingly enough, compensation and benefits, although they were leading investments made by organizations, were not the leading strategies used by organizations, right? So you're investing in compensation and benefits, but those are not necessarily those elements of your organization that are causing people to stay. Learning and development, engagement, and culture are the leading three strategies that we're seeing by organizations. We, like we did with the other data, we broke it down to see if there were any critical differences between small and large nonprofits. And what we learned was that organizations that were smaller tended to focus more on learning and professional development, which is interesting because these are the same organizations that are also challenged with keeping people because of limited upward mobility opportunities, right? So we're seeing organizations invest in the learning and professional development of their staff as a way of keeping them, knowing that ultimately they may choose to leave because there's nowhere for them to go. So it's a bit of a dichotomy, it's a bit of a conflict, but something that is important to note. And then what we noted was that larger organizations, those with budgets of 40 million or more, tended to focus on culture and engagement as their leading retention strategy. All right, we've just got a few more data points to share, and then we will move into our next segment. So in terms of retention tactics that we see organizations using the most, the exit interview is still kind of a window into the soul of the organization and is the leading tactic used by those who participated to help them understand why people leave. I think that's great. What we are seeing at Nonprofit HR and what we've pushed many of our clients, encouraged many of our clients to do actually, is to focus on the stay interview, why people stay. Reason being is because at the exit interview, folks are already out the door. We've lost them at the point of the exit interview. But if we engage in the stay interview process, that really allows folks in leadership and in HR to understand what is happening with people before they make the decision to leave, right? So a stay interview is essentially asking the employees in your organization, what causes you to return every day? What's working for you? What's keeping you happy? What are some things that maybe we need to address to keep you engaged and productive, right? And so asking those questions at random points throughout the employee life cycle is a really great way to retain staff. Now, that's not what the data show, but in our experience, the stay interview is a powerful tool in your arsenal of tactics that you can use and clearly underutilized here. So following exit interviews, what we saw was that effective onboarding was the next leading tactic used by organizations to retain folks. So making sure that their onboarding experience is positive, that they have the information that they need to navigate through the organization as they progress through the employee life cycle. Followed by engagement surveys. And engagement surveys are actually a really good way of gauging the extent to which employees feel connected to their work, to their colleagues, and to the organization's mission. So we applaud every organization that is engaging in the use of engagement surveys. It's a great strategy for retaining staff, understanding where there might be some landmines that need to be addressed. And culture and climate surveys have the same effect, although not rated as highly as a tactic used by nonprofits. Recognition programs follow right behind engagement surveys. So those are programs where we recognize high performers, those who've contributed to the organization in a special way, in a meaningful way. Those programs seem to have a really positive effect on an organization's abilities to retain staff. You'll see things like bonuses and loyalty programs falling kind of below the line there, less frequently used by nonprofits, of course, not to any surprise. The use of bonuses as a retention tactic is not commonly seen in the nonprofit sector. I'm going to pause here before we move into the next segment of our presentation today to see if we have any questions. Alicia?
Lisa, we did have one question that just asked what was the time period for the data?
The survey actually just closed less than 3 weeks ago. So this is very, very current data, 2019 data, fresh off the press.
I think it was referring to the turnover data, which I believe was for 2018.
Yes, 2018 data. Yes, my apologies. Yeah, 2018 data on turnover.
You're listening to The Switch. Follow along with this podcast. Download the slides and other visual materials at nonprofithr.com/The Switch.
Okay, well, let's move on to chat about employee retention and what this data really means for your organization. The first thing is we have a problem. As a sector, as a social enterprise space or nonprofit space, whether you're a foundation, association, a nonprofit, a social enterprise, there's kind of a collective challenge that we have as a social sector with keeping and retaining employees. And let's spend a little time talking about what that looks like. At the end of the day, when we looked across this data and we analyzed this data, there are kind of three key factors that drive employee retention and drive voluntary turnover, right? They include awareness by the organization, intention, meaning, will you be intentional about addressing the retention problem that may exist in your organization, and then developing strategies to support higher levels of retention of staff. So when we look across the retention problem, let's just spend some time talking about the awareness issue, right? Our observations and the data would suggest, by virtue of the fact that, some 80% of nonprofits do not have a retention strategy, that there's a general awareness that a problem exists, but there's no real plan, kind of collectively, not within individual organizations, but collectively there's no real plan to address the retention of nonprofit employees, right? Organizations know they have a problem, but they're not able to or have not yet developed a strategy for addressing the problem. So that's something, we need to work on the awareness level that retention levels are as high as they are, or lack of retention is as high as it is. The other challenge that we have, which is what drove us to conduct this survey, is that there really wasn't a lot of data around nonprofit retention practices. And as we looked out there to address our clients' needs and to respond to calls from folks reaching out to us for information, we recognized that there was not a big pool of available information. And so the more data, particularly benchmarking data that's available, the easier it is for organizations to understand where they stand in relation to others. And so we remain committed to continuing to produce data that will help raise awareness levels and help organizations benchmark themselves. We have a national unemployment rate of 3.6%. That's the national rate. Obviously, if you're you may be in parts of the country where the rate is higher, or you may be in parts of the country where the rate is lower. And so the question is, with a 3.6% unemployment rate and us being in a job seeker market, it is critical that we as organizations invest in the retention of the staff that we really want to keep. Because as my mom says, they can pick, choose, and refuse from opportunities that exist out there in the marketplace without ever having to leave the sector. Nonprofits are hiring at equal rates as for-profit entities. And so we have to be dialed into the fact that job seekers have options, and they are not required to stay with you, and they may choose not to if any of those elements that we talked about earlier, like culture and leadership, and those things are not at optimal levels. I think another factor that we need to consider is the ongoing growth of the social enterprise space and corporate social responsibility, right? That's what CSR stands for in this particular case. So there's growth of the social enterprise sector and space, and then corporate social responsibility has become very sexy in the corporate world. And those two components, the social enterprise space and growing corporate social responsibility programs in the for-profit world, are pulling on the talent that nonprofits traditionally recruit from. And so another factor amplified by, or on top of the low unemployment rate, is the fact that we're now competing with organizations that perhaps we didn't in the past. And I just want to bring your attention to Deloitte's Human Capital Trends survey called The Rise of the Social Enterprise. And it's just an interesting nugget that citizenship and social impact were rated as critical or important by 77% of Deloitte's Human Capital Trends participants. The vast majority of those survey participants are for-profit corporations. And so if the for-profit world is prioritizing citizenship and social impact, it's likely and it's reasonable to extract from that those organizations are looking for talent to support those efforts. And where are they going to get that talent? They're going to get it from the nonprofit space, from the social sector space, from organizations such as yours. And so it's important for us to be dialed into that. The other thing that we've noted is there remains a general lack of urgency among social sector leaders around the importance of talent to mission attainment and sustainability. So what does that mean? We still talk about mission and sustainability separate from our conversations, or perhaps void of conversations about talent. And as a result, this issue of employee retention is not going to kind of bubble up to the surface, right? So it's important for us to, if we're in leadership positions in our organizations, to bring this data kind of to the top brass of our organizations and help them understand that this is an urgent issue, both for individual organizations and the sector at large, but certainly for the vast majority of organizations that are challenged with retaining their staff. Oftentimes, the leadership are not dialed in. They're just not paying attention, and there's a lack of urgency around the fact that employees are not being retained. It wasn't too long ago that it was kind of a common language in among leaders in nonprofits that we could just find someone else, right? And that if the employees in our organization aren't happy, then they can go somewhere else and we'll hire someone else. Well, those days are over. And so it's going to be really important for organizations to raise their awareness level around retention practices that will work for their organization. Let's move on. So we mentioned earlier that almost 81% of nonprofits operate without employee retention strategy. And I'm going to keep kind of drilling that point in because that's a really large percentage of organizations operating without a plan to keep one of their most valuable assets. When you look at your profit and loss statement, you look at your budget, you're probably spending your greatest amount of money. Your largest expense is likely around salary and budget. And so why not have a strategy that allows you to invest and retain that asset for as long as possible? Not to mention the fact that if you lose someone prematurely, particularly someone who's high performing, the costs associated with turnover and the cost to hire someone equally qualified are likely to be higher than what you hired that departing employee for, right? So there's a lot of costs associated with not being able to retain staff, but a lot of this comes from the fact that we're not intentional about keeping the staff that we have. We tend not to have plans, we're not prepared, and therefore, without the preparation, we don't have protection. What does protection look like? Protection looks like having a plan, right? Having a strategy in place to keep the people in your organization that you need to keep. We know that organizations are prioritizing organizational performance and performance impact, but not employee retention, and the data proves that. But we also know that organizational performance, is driven by culture. There's the saying that culture eats strategy for breakfast, right? So it's one thing to have a great strategy, a great organizational strategy, a great mission, a beautiful vision and mission statement. But if the culture in your organization is not functional, it's not optimal, it will absolutely have an impact on your ability to retain staff, which will ultimately drive turnover, which will also impact your ability to attract new staff to your organization. I probably should have put an arrow between culture and attraction, because if you are operating and if your organization is unhealthy and operating with a dysfunctional culture, the word will get out about that, and that will directly impact your ability to attract and retain talent. I'm sure most of you are familiar with Glassdoor at this point. Go online, look at your Glassdoor profile, and if you know that your organization has a dysfunctional workplace culture, I can almost bet you that that fact is showing up publicly and is not being kept behind closed doors. The employees that are being impacted by the negative culture that may exist in your organization are likely to be public about it increasingly. People are much more apt to talk about their work and their workplaces when those workplaces are not going well. And so if you're unable to attract the right kind of talent, it's going to impact your organization's performance and its ability to achieve its mission. So you can see it's kind of one big circle, right? So being intentional about retention, there's a lot of value to being intentional. There's a kind of a strong business case, and this is the business case in the visual. You want strong performance. You want to be impactful in the communities that you serve. Therefore, it's important to be sure that your culture is healthy, that you're able to retain staff, that you keep your turnover levels to an appropriate level based on your space and where you operate, and that you're able to attract new staff that will continue to be able to make your organizational impactful, right? So it's all kind of tied together.
You have been listening to The Switch, a nonprofit HR podcast on powering your people with talent management insights, best practices, and hacks. Looking for a thought partner to help you integrate talent into your mission strategic plan? Well, the good news is Nonprofit HR has solutions to meet your unique talent management needs. Strategic planning is an annual ritual for many nonprofits, yet countless organizations plan for programs and fundraising without thinking about the talent needed to meet those goals and ultimately their mission. With more than 20 years of expertise under our belt and the bench strength of credentialed consultants, we partner with all mission types and offer solutions that span project-based human resources, consulting, and outsourcing, search, total rewards, and DEI. Join the community of social impact organizations that have trusted nonprofit HR to help them achieve their full potential through their people.
Let's talk about strategy for a minute. Again, 81% of nonprofits operate without an employee retention strategy. Increasingly, higher, that number is higher among small nonprofits. So we mentioned that it's at 89% of small nonprofits operate without one, and then 65% of larger nonprofits, those with budgets of $40 million or more, who are also likely to have dedicated HR talent within their organization or someone managing the talent management function, they tend to have employee retention strategies in their organizations, right? But we also know that almost 23% of nonprofits expect their turnover to increase in 2019. That came from the survey that we just did, this nonprofit retention practices survey. And so among those organizations that are expecting turnover to increase, the question is, do those organizations have a plan? Are they aware that there's a problem in their organizations? Are they intentional about addressing the fact that turnover is likely to increase in their organizations? And then finally, is there a strategy in place to keep that premature turnover at bay, right? The voluntary termination and resignations at bay. Ultimately, having a strategy requires a thorough examination and understanding of how reward, meaning comp and benefits, culture, engagement, learning, and leadership impact your retention and your ability to retain talent within your organization. So if you had to kind of put them across pillars, you'd want to look to see whether or not anything in your reward system or your culture or the extent to which people are engaged, or how learning takes place, how leadership is showing up, how each of those things are impacting your ability to keep people, and then develop strategies to address those concerns and to drive your retention levels higher and your turnover lower. All right, so with the time we have remaining, we want to kind of get into some action planning or some things that will help you make this data usable. So there are really three things that we want to focus on today as a way of fostering and supporting higher levels of retention within organizations. And they really drill down to these three things: leadership, culture, and career quality. When you look across the landscape of data, not only that we just produced, but also data from other organizations like Accenture, Deloitte, BCG, some of the other leading firms in the country, consulting firms in the country, the research tells us, regardless of subsector, regardless of industry, that leadership, culture, and career quality, meaning the opportunity to grow and develop, are the three leading components that make up the retention equation, right? So let's break those down just a little bit. When we talk about leaders, we know that leaders set the tone for their organization, right? Leaders are also responsible for ensuring that teams or staff can have open, engaging, and cohesive work environments. Those are things that almost every employee wants, regardless of the space that they work in. So whether you're an arts and culture organization, or you're environmental, or you're a foundation, or you're an association, chances are that the staff in your organization want to have an open environment, an engaging environment, and a cohesive environment where folks are not kind of fighting and working against each other. Leaders are also responsible for creating alignment between mission goals and individual contributions, right? Helping staff understand where they fit in and what contributions they're making to the organization. Values like openness, transparency, organizational agility are all things that are driven by and the responsibility of leaders. I love this quote by Brian Tracy: "The best leaders have a high consideration factor. They really care about their people." Ultimately, strong leaders who create open, engaging, cohesive, transparent, agile organizations are those that care about their employees. And what we see is in those organizations where leadership is dialed in, they're paying attention, not just to programs and fundraising and finance, but also to talent. Those are the organizations that tend to be most impactful and tend to have better retention levels. So leadership is a key component to driving staff retention. There are 8 hints for your nonprofit to know whether or not you have a leadership problem. And I want you to just think about the leadership in your organization and how they show up, how they're perceived by staff. If you don't know how they're perceived, it's an excellent question to ask as part of that state interview conversation, to just randomly pull employees into quick 15-minute, 20-minute conversations around why they stay. Ask them about their perceptions about leadership. And if they perceive that leadership isn't credible and that they're not clear about the vision, or they're not engaged in setting the culture, and don't reflect an understanding of the importance of diversity, or they're rigid, or they fail to balance between taking risk and managing risk, or they alienate their peers at the leadership level, or they're simply not dialed in, those are the organizations where you're not likely to keep your staff as long as you could, right? So these are just some of the hints that you might have a leadership problem in your organization. And I would say that if you can check the box on, more than 4 of these, you really need to examine the leadership and explore where there might be opportunities to shore up and improve the leadership in your organization as a strategy for driving higher levels of employee retention, right? So leadership matters. It absolutely matters. And people leave leaders. They don't necessarily leave organizations. They may love the work that they do, but if their leaders are driving them crazy, they're more likely to leave. So it's really important that as you think about solutions to what may be a high retention or a high turnover problem in your organization, to take a quick and important look at leadership. The second action area to focus on from our perspective is around culture. When we talk about culture, what do we mean? We're talking about values, either implicit or explicit values, those that are stated and those that are just understood, right? Beliefs within your organization, work ethic, acceptable behavior, unwritten rules, how an organization articulates its value proposition to both staff and stakeholders. That's what we mean by culture. And it's important to pay attention to culture, because at the end of the day, when an organization's culture is effective, it can absolutely help to drive talent attraction, your ability to hire new talent, high-performing talent. When organizations are effective, it supports employee engagement as well as employee satisfaction. And ultimately, as we showed on that earlier slide, can affect individual and organizational performance. Conversely, when individual and organizational performance is negatively impacted by engagement and culture and satisfaction, performance is absolutely negatively impacted and disproportionately impacted. So it's really important to dial into culture. How do you do that? Assess your culture. Don't assume that you know. Develop some questions that will help you understand what is impacting individual and organizational performance. If you ask the questions, chances are your staff will tell you. The question is, what do you do with that information? So pay attention to culture. Culture really matters, and I would argue it matters even more than strategy. Finally, the data from our retention practices survey, and then data that's already published, supports the fact that today's workforce is looking for opportunities for development, learning and development. 59.6% of voluntary turnover from our survey that we just closed is driven by a lack of career mobility and development. And so it does matter whether or not you create a learning environment in your organization. Career quality is impacted by the ability to learn. So it really does matter. And when we say career quality, we're really talking about the opportunity to learn, the opportunity to grow and experience new things. And growth does not always have to be upward. Growth can be lateral across an organization, or it can be deepening a skill set that a person already has. But that's what we mean by career quality. Improving soft skills, having the ability to continuously learn, to grow professionally, to have career enhancing or enriching experiences. But it also requires that we realize as leaders and as HR people, when our organization can no longer meet the learning and development needs of our staff, and us being okay with folks moving on. Knowing that we may have prepared someone to be a really great employee somewhere else. And if that other organization does the same, and you happen to be the beneficiary of the talent that they developed, that helps your organization, right? So I know it's hard to train someone and to invest in someone's professional development and have them leave, but to not invest in career development in today's workforce and for today's workforce is absolutely not a recipe for success.
You're listening to The Switch. Follow along with this podcast. Download the slides and other visual materials at nonprofithr.com/The Switch.
Finally, we want to just point out 5 steps that you can take to ensure the strong career development, a strong career development climate in your organization. One is to understand the skills that do exist by doing a staff inventory or skills inventory. The other is to make sure that when you are investing in career development and learning, that it's aligned to your mission and goals, right? That you're investing in the development of staff in support of the mission to drive that mission forward. It's also important to address skills gaps based on what your mission is. So if you have a mission to, grow your after-school programs by 15%, you obviously need the talent to be able to do that. You need to develop the skills of your staff who are responsible for those after-school programs, right? Giving them the support that they need to grow and develop. So addressing skills gaps based on mission and goals is critical. We also know that the workforce is becoming more diverse, and hopefully will become more equitable. And so ensuring that there is equal access to learning and career development opportunities across your organization is important. What does that mean? That means don't only invest in leadership development, but also invest in staff development. Ensure that the staff in your organization who may be younger have access to learning, but also make sure that the more senior folks on your staff, both in age and experience, have opportunities to learn and develop as well. And it goes without saying that staff of color should have equal access to learning opportunities, the same access that others on your staff have. So there are all kinds of opportunities that exist to ensure that you have fostered an environment of equal access in your organization. And then finally, not putting limits on your high performers is a really important consideration as you think about career development in your nonprofit. Providing growth opportunities was identified as one of the key factors in providing a great employee experience. That comes from Deloitte's Human Capital Trends Report of 2017. And I would argue that this statement applies to the nonprofit sector as well. I have flown through the data in today's survey. I would love to take any questions that you may have.
Yes, we have several questions, and we've had several questions on the slides, and the slides that you receive will have corrected, you'll be able to see the full descriptions on those graphs. So you had a few questions on stay interviews. In particular, should they be done through online surveys and in person? What's the best way? How often? And who is responsible for conducting those?
So we recommend that stay interviews be done in person. If you're a very large organization, then the online approach would certainly be more efficient. But in terms of effectiveness, our experience is that stay interviews are best done in person. They shouldn't involve more than about 3 or 4 critical questions, 5 at most. Nonprofit HR does have a sample stay interview template, so please look out for that. In terms of frequency, do them as often as you need to. There's no need to place a limit. You can regularly do it as part of your talent management activity in your organization. Randomly pulling staff who represent the full diversity of your staff, so senior folks, younger people, new people, Black, white, Asian, Latino, everybody that you can ask, and do it on an ongoing and regular basis so you can keep yourself dialed into the needs of the organization.
Okay, and we have a couple questions that I'll just mix together and asking, how do you decide which retention strategies will have the most impact in your organization? And if you're a small organization with maybe a department of one in your HR with limited resources, how do you tackle those?
Well, I would say, how do you prioritize? I would really focus on culture, understanding what's going on in the culture of your organization and how that is driving retention. Within culture is an understanding about how leadership is showing up, how the work is being done, the physical environment. All of those questions are captured in a good cultural needs assessment. And so a focus on culture will really give you some very valuable insights to what may be driving retention and premature turnover within your organization, and then really prioritizing the issue or the issues that rise to the top and focusing on those because they'll likely have the greatest impact if addressed.
Okay, and then in terms of if you're a small HR department, how can you address those?
If you're a small HR department, I would say get some help, right? Find either a consultant in your area or a volunteer from the HR profession in the local SHRM chapter, someone who could volunteer and work with you to capture the data. There may be a trust issue in your organization, and so it may be hard for folks to open up to the internal HR staff. Sometimes having a third party is helpful, which is why folks use surveys, but I would strongly encourage getting a consultant or getting a third party volunteer to assist you with collecting that information. Obviously, someone who's qualified and experienced to do this kind of work.
Okay, and then a final question of how does an HR team effectively address issues with culture and retention when leadership finds HR's input unneeded or threatening?
Wow, what a loaded question. I know we're out of time. We'll have to take that one offline in the interest of time, but we will provide a meaningful answer to that question. I would say lead with the data, lead with the facts, and making a business case for the necessary and important investment in talent, recognizing that employees are likely the largest expense on your profit and loss statement, the most significant expense that the organization spends money on, and is warrants investment and retention.
Well, that's our show for today. Thank you for listening in to The Switch. Does your organization need to talk with someone about the topics we covered today? Nonprofit HR is your thought partner for all talent management lifecycle needs. We've served the social sector exclusively for more than 20 years. Call us 202-785-2060 or email us for a mini consult, info@nonprofithr.com. Looking for more episodes of The Switch? Visit nonprofithr.com/The Switch and access recordings and resources to help your organization maximize its greatest asset, your